Betty Joseph a moment ago, and you mentioned maybe not tight but close connection between Bjorn and Betty Joseph.
Yes.
I would like to ask you about your participation, your experience of this Betty Joseph workshop. You participated and influence on your clinical thinking. I remember that you mentioned it's your first paper given in public. I've got this paper here. The Patient's Defensive Analyst was the fruit of this workshop or participation in this workshop.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Could I elaborate? Off the cuff, without thinking. I did my training, the seminars between 1971 and 74, 75, and I thought the psychoanalytic training was not very inspiring. The analysis, your personal analysis and supervision, fine. There were only two people who ran seminars in the training that were, I felt, inspiring. One was Betty Joseph, and after I qualified, a few years after I qualified, I decided to join her postgraduate seminar. There were many people who ran postgraduate seminars, and she agreed to me going to her seminar, and I went for 3 or 4 years. I wasn't a lifelong member like some people who were there forever. She ran them for 20 or 30 years, I think. My impression of them, I find it extremely difficult to capture a clear description of what the seminars were like. They happened, as I recall, twice a month in her rather large, elegant house in St John's Wood in London, where she provided coffee and little petit fours and biscuits and things in a very genteel way. Betty was a very genteel lady, and extremely hospitable and a very good sort of hostess in the English manner. So she created a nice atmosphere. I found I was with lots of people who were senior to me, which made it a slightly daunting experience to be around with them. I'd been qualified, 3 or 4 years? And there were other people, Widow Shaughnessy, Elizabeth Spilius, as well as some people less senior, including the sort of generational layer, people who were significantly influenced by Betty Joseph, John Steiner, Ron Britton and Mike Feldman. They were probably already training analysts by then. So I felt it a rather daunting experience, and I did more listening than speaking, so that I got more out of it than I put into it, I think, probably. And I got a lot out of it. This was in around 1980, I think maybe 79, maybe 80, maybe 81. Betty wrote a whole series of papers, but the first significant paper was in 1975, a paper, Patients Who Are Hard to Reach. So a lot of her papers hadn't been written. I knew her paper, Patients Who Are Hard to Reach, and was very interested in that paper. I think one of the big things I got out of it, in professional terms, in terms of technique and so on, was the sense of the patient as an active person, who being a person in the session, who was engaged with the person of the analyst. Something which you don't always get from Freud, who seems to be at a bit of a distance, and one always gets the impression of Freud as behind the couch, and as this distance, physical distance, and non-eye contact and so on. But I got a sense with Betty of somebody who could engage with the patient on the couch in a way which was sensitive to what the patient was trying to experience and trying to do. I thought of and maybe I wasn't all that in key with other people in the seminar, but I thought of the situation even then as much more of an equality of two people being together. I had by then my formative experience in therapeutic communities, where the ethos is to erode the boundary between patients and staff, that patients have to engage actively in their treatment as much as the staff have to engage in the patient's treatment, if not more than the staff have to engage. There's a responsibility on both sides. Patients are not passive recipients. Something which I now understand, well, I understood then, I suppose, came from these experimental work in military psychiatry and that Beyond has been involved in. I didn't know at the time that Betty Joseph was quite close in terms of her clinical thinking and as a family friend to Beyond, and they started their training together in 1945, when Beyond had been widowed for 6 months with a young baby. I understand that Betty helped out a bit with the family Beyond's management of this difficult situation, managing his family with this young baby under a year old. I was, I suppose that's my first thoughts, this more egalitarian view of the two people being responsible together. Of course, Betty Joseph's view of the patient's responsibility was not that they were necessarily being very responsible, and that they coming to a psychoanalytic treatment where the aim, the acknowledged aim, is to dissolve as much as possible some of the defences that people have and which cause them trouble in their lives and in their relationships. Patients often came to analysts with a determination to repeat their defences and to engage with the analyst in such a way that they didn't have to face their terrifying demons in their heads, so they weren't always responsible. The patients weren't always responsible. But I think Betty Jo is very clear about that. But she seemed extremely respectful, and patients had to do their best, and their best might not always have been to cooperate fully with the analyst. In terms of the patient's feeling of what's best, it may be better to close up and not get invaded by all one's demons. So, I guess that was one of the, perhaps the most foundational things that I got in terms of the technical thinking about what one does with one's patients in the consulting room. There, that's a start. Want to know any more? What more do you want me to say?
Oh, it's quite intensive and extensive answer. So.
Oh, it is certainly is an extremely formative experience. And you mentioned the paper, yes, you mentioned this paper on the defensive analyst, and I guess that came out of two things. One was what I've just been talking about, and the way that analysts can become involved with patients in a defensive process, defensive for both the patient and the analyst. And the analyst has to be very cautious. I guess I read Paul Hyman's paper on countertransference and the risk of becoming a mechanical brain, as Paul Hyman put it, and the need for the analyst to be as open as possible about their own feelings and experiences, and what one could, and how one could use that as an instrument, as a tool, I think she says, for understanding the patient and the patient's unconscious. I suppose the other motivation for the paper was that it's really rather difficult being an analyst, I found, after I'd started on my career, and one had to have quite a presence of mind to be able to deal with all the pressures and the anxieties and the demands of being in the analyst's chair. And that I suppose I was thinking my way through how the analyst has to cope with a very emotional situation that's composed of the patient's pressures plus the analyst's own pressures, composed of the influences of his training and his own analysis and all his hang-ups and problems and so on from the past. If one really takes it seriously, that the analyst is not a mechanical brain, then the analyst is a vulnerable person, and one needs to try to think one's way through, in personal terms, in one's own work, about how one's own vulnerability and anxieties and conflicts and so on, and how one brings one's past into it as well. So I suppose that's what I was trying to explore in the paper at quite an it feels now it's quite an early stage. 1983, I think I gave the paper as a public lecture. When was it published? 85 or
85.
85, yes. I think I gave it in 1983 to a group of, it was a psychotherapy organisation, perhaps a bit like the Kraków school, which was, actually I better not say too much about it because it wasn't a very creditable organisation as it turned out in the end. But they thought they were needed to have more of a public image, and they started some public lectures, so they asked me to do one of the lectures. I don't know. Well, at this time my egalitarian instincts, for what they were worth, led me into working with some of the psychotherapy training. There were a number that started up in the late 1970s and early 1980s in London, and there were about half a dozen different schools of psychotherapy training, and I was dragged into one or two of these, the Lincoln Centre, which you may have heard of. The one that I was more involved with was the London Centre for Psychotherapy. They've all merged now into one group, but at the time they were small fragments and pretty rivalrous with each other. But I was rather in favour of the development of a psychotherapy profession as well as a psychoanalytic profession, which even at the time I thought was rather elitist, I suppose. I had a strong commitment to the public service, and I suppose all my life I've worked in the public service, and in a minor way still do, although I did have a psychoanalytic practice which at its biggest was probably about 2/3 of my time. But I did see not just 5 times a week patients, but I did see psychotherapy patients and once a week patients sometimes, and I did see patients who were trainees for some of these psychotherapy trainings. So this was my egalitarian ethic, yes. I was so egalitarian that around about the mid-80s I tried to get a number of these groups, small psychotherapy groups, together and succeeded with a lot of them to establish a psychotherapy journal. I thought this would be good for the establishing psychotherapy in England, in London, and I got a group of these small organisations to commit themselves to supporting the development of a psychotherapy journal, British Journal of Psychotherapy. I'm getting off the topic, but this is connected with the paper and my commitment to, beyond the Psychoanalytical Society, to psychotherapy as a profession that is or is not distinct from psychoanalysis. I've never really understood quite the distinction. I see it as a gradation, and my discomfort with the Psychoanalytical Society seeing a very heavy, a very clear, strict difference between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and my commitment to the public service, where virtually psychoanalysis practiced according to the Psychoanalytic Society did not exist. It was more or less non-existent in the public service. 5 times a week psychoanalysis was not, it did not exist in the public service, and now it definitely doesn't exist in the public service. It can inspire aspects of psychiatry and of psychiatric staff. At the time we're talking about, back in the late 70s and the 1980s, the National Health Service did support, I think, 6 psychoanalytic treatments at the Psychoanalytic Society. The Society had its own clinic called the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis, and I think 6 of those patients, and they were patients that were treated for a low fee, as was traditional in psychoanalysis from very early on, wasn't it? Way back in Vienna, there was an expectation that psychoanalysts would have 1 or 2 patients who paid nothing or very little. And that tradition was still around in the 70s and 80s, and the National Health Service supported about 6 patients in the entire country in the London Clinic psychoanalysis. It doesn't anymore. That was stopped, I think, in the late 80s or 90s. So here's me, an old man, reminiscing about all sorts of things in terms of my career. I suppose I mentioned my egalitarian ethic. I don't know if I should. I mean, that's what took me into psychoanalysis and into the Psychoanalytic Society, and makes me a strong supporter of the Psychoanalytical Society and of British psychoanalysis, even though I also feel it's rather elitist. But I qualified as a doctor in 1965. God, this is ancient history, isn't it? And at the time I qualified, I knew I was going to be a psychiatrist. That was going to be my specialty. I think I knew I was pretty disturbed and I needed psychiatry. So that was a fairly easy way of getting into. At that time, I think quite a lot of people went into psychiatry because they were pretty disturbed people. So I went into psychiatry in 1966, I suppose. I got a job at my teaching hospital, University College Hospital, where Bion had trained, by the way. Not that I knew that then. That was a bit of a shock. That there's a ward in the hospital with people who were very, I don't know what word one can use without being derogatory, but they were less than human beings, and certainly they led lives which were less than a human life. And I found this disturbing. It was what was called an observation ward, which was an old style of British psychiatry from before the Second World War that was named to have observation wards in the community to sort out those patients who would need to go on to a large mental hospital, and those people who are not so disturbed and should be protected from going on to a large mental hospital. There was an awareness at the time that people could be confined in a mental hospital when they were not so disturbed and spent their entire lives there. Psychiatry was desperately inhumane, I thought. Including some of the treatments like ECT, which seemed like treating animals. It was a kind of veterinary procedure. I thought a lot of psychiatry was a veterinary procedure. So you can tell that I reacted against this. And then I went on to a large mental hospital after a year of working in the middle of London, in the teaching hospital, which was an enlightened hospital, Shenley Hospital, which had a reputation for being enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see, yes, that there were people there who wanted to do something, some doctors, some nurses. And there had been a famous ward at Shenley Hospital called Villa 21, which had tried to treat schizophrenics, male, young schizophrenics, with a non-institutional regime, loosely related to therapeutic communities, run by a man called David Cooper. I don't know if anyone in Poland has ever heard of David Cooper, but he's bracketed with a man called Ronnie Lang, R.D. Lang. Anyone heard of? Yeah, good, that's good. Who was very active at this time when I was a young psychiatrist in training. Not that there was much training for psychiatrists then. So I really rather signed up to this sort of movement which came to be known as anti-psychiatry, the alternative psychiatry movement, anti-psychiatry. And Ronnie Lang, as you know, said all these people who get incarcerated in mental hospitals and called schizophrenics, they're really the healthy ones. It's society which is sick. And these are the people who know society is sick and keep out of it. This was an extreme point of view, and he didn't get very far with it. He became, I think, alcoholic and died fairly young, but not without inspiring an awful lot of people like me. So this was one of my views strongly held at the time, that institutional life for psychiatric patients is worse than the disease of schizophrenia itself. So I was very much along the lines of deinstitutionalizing patients and deinstitutionalizing the institutions. So I think of myself as a bit of a radical, not that I was very effective in doing very much in that respect, but I did become part of the therapeutic community movement, and I'm still part of it.